I'm very excited to be here today to talk about Grammarly's journey towards superhuman communication assistance. This is the agenda for today. First, I'll give a quick intro of how we actually think about communication assistance, what it actually means in our minds. Then we'll jump into some details, some technical details of how we approach building the product to solve some aspect of communication assistance. Then we'll go ahead and sort of take a sneak peek at some of the other things we've been working on, and then I will conclude with questions. So let's jump in and talk about communication assistance. When we think about communication assistance, we really try to break it down into actual human processes and try to frame it in actual user problems. So imagine you are at work and you're writing a very important project proposal. First, you have to really conceptualize what you're trying to express, right? That's the conception phase here at the top. How do you best structure your proposal? What information do you want to include? How do you make the most convincing arguments in the best possible way? Then as you've got that figured out, you move over to the composition phase. Now you're trying to really get your thoughts down on, I guess, virtual paper. This takes many forms, and everybody has a different approach to this. Sometimes you might spend hours on just perfecting that one paragraph. Sometimes you crank out multiple pages in one go. But once you're done with this, now you spend a lot of time really fine-tuning your writing. You really want to make it as perfect as possible. So that's what we call the revision stage. You want to make sure, of course, that your writing is grammatically perfect, there are no spelling mistakes, but you also want to make sure that it fits into the right length constraints, right? You want to make sure people read whatever you've written. If it's 25 pages, chances are quite low that everybody will go through everything. And more importantly, you want to make sure that it's coming across in an authentic way. You want to hit the right tone, but you also want to make sure it's clear and it's resonating with your audience. Now, that's all done. You're ready to share your writing. Great. Now your team, for example, might take a look at it and they're trying to understand your points. They're trying to understand the arguments you're trying to make and sort of how to best provide feedback. But once they're done with that, you receive that feedback and now you go into sort of another round of this communication iteration, if you will. And it's quite clear that this cycle keeps continuing on because communication is inherently a multiplayer activity. You never just communicate in a silo. It's really important for you to sort of express your ideas, to convince others, to make sure others are getting your key points. And ultimately, you learn from them as well. You take their feedback into consideration, you adapt what you're writing, you revise it, and you improve it. And this wheel keeps spinning. And what we found is that this is especially true now where more and more work is fully remote. It's especially important to make sure that these communication cycles work effectively, no matter whether you're writing this very important project proposal or whether you are, writing an important email to your whole organization, or whether you're just responding to a Slack message. And our vision at Grammarly really is to provide assistance across this entire communication journey for tens of millions of users every single day. Okay, cool. So that's the big vision. Let's double click into one specific phase, which we call the revision phase, to illustrate a little bit what types of problems users actually face there. Now, there's no denying that, misspellings, grammar issues, rogue punctuation really undercuts your message and otherwise brilliant writing. So we think of correctness really as the foundation of the revision stage and make sure that, there are no mistakes in your writing. Now, I personally oftentimes struggle really absorbing and making sense of sentences or paragraphs, and that's especially true in fairly technical and complex writing. So hitting the right clarity is a really important aspect to make sure that your readers are connecting and understanding with your writing and really taking away the key points. Now, dull, unengaging writing does a disservice both to you as a writer, but more importantly to the reader as well. Even if you have an amazing idea, you have great grammar and it's really tight, it still doesn't help you if the reader gets bored after just 2 paragraphs. So choosing vivid words, varying the rhythm of your writing really helps to keep the reader interested and get them through the whole content all the way from the beginning to the end. Now, last and certainly not least, delivery is really, really important in writing. It's not just the literal meaning of the word, but really how it's being delivered. In writing, it's especially important to focus on this delivery because you can't rely on your voice or your facial expressions like I do right now to project dimensions like sincerity, confidence, politeness, or whatever else you're trying to convey. So these are the 4 dimensions that we think about as we think about sort of this revision stage as part of the communication journey. I'm pretty sure by now you're wondering, okay, but how do you actually solve for some of those dimensions? And I don't have enough time to go into detail across all 4 of them, but let's double click into correctness specifically to describe our approach of how technology and specifically machine learning and natural language processing can come together in a very user-centric way to solve real problems that our users face every single day. Okay, this is going to be a little more technical and will resemble something that looks like a flow chart, but I hope it's going to be useful to illustrate how we use this technology. So imagine there's some user input. That might be a sentence that you're writing. And now we're thinking about solving the problem of correctness, which we call grammatical error correction, also known as GEC. So we take that writing and now we pre-process that. And that is actually a surprisingly big task because you have to apply all kinds of natural language processing technologies as well as machine learning technologies to get the text ready for any subsequent modeling on any subsequent decision making. And that ranges all the way from language detection, tokenization, or syntactic parsing. Now from there, this processed sentence goes into 2 different systems. At the bottom, we have a box called human knowledge. And that really reflects sort of human interpretation of language, and in this case of grammar and spelling theory, that gives us a very precise experience. And that can be pretty simple of like, yeah, this word probably should be capitalized. It can also get really, really complex in disambiguating ambiguous prepositions, for example. Now, in addition to this, however, and those are the 2 boxes above the bottom one, we use machine learning, large machine learning models for different reasons. And specifically there, we approach this in 2 ways. One is to rewrite the sentence, the entire sentence. So basically think of it as the sentence that you wrote might be potentially incorrect, and we want to translate this into a correct sentence. So that's one approach. And the other one focuses a little bit more on a tagging model, both of which are transformer-based models and state-of-the-art. So these 2 systems come together, and then ultimately we classify the sets of transformations and explain them to the user. And this is a really, really important dimension of the product. We want to augment our users. We never want to replace them. So we always give our users choices, and then for them to make a choice, they have to understand why we're making certain suggestions. So it's really important to clarify why they are receiving our suggestions. And then it all comes together in the user experience. And our approach has been very much to focus on ubiquity. Anywhere where users write, we want to be able to provide assistance. You can see here, there's just some examples. We exist in a desktop app, in a browser extension, with a web editor, as well as mobile keyboard. So it's really critical to make sure that users can rely on us no matter where they do their writing. So this is our approach towards correctness. As I mentioned before, we utilize both human knowledge in form of rules and augment this with machine learning. But it's quite obvious oftentimes why we actually need to rely on this human knowledge to overcome some of the, perhaps surprising mistakes or inefficiencies that a model might make. And here's just one of those examples that's quite interesting to unpack. But yeah, let me talk a little bit more about sort of our approach of humans in the loop to generate a degree of user centricity. So really putting the human in the center is not only a principle within the product that we want to augment our users, but it's also a very important paradigm for us as we build our product and as we develop new capabilities. At Grammarly, a really cross-functional team comes together to build our capabilities. And that ranges all the way from analytical and computational linguists to applied research scientists, machine learning engineers, data scientists, product managers, designers, UX researchers, and so on. So it's a very broad spectrum of people, and everybody is bringing a different degree of user centricity to our development process. And I think this is really important as we think about these fundamental communication problems that our users face every single day. And especially our linguists help us translate this human knowledge that I described earlier into code and into rules that we can apply in our product. So what this gives us is first a strong focus on precision. We can really focus on high quality, high confidence rewriting experiences and suggestions that augment our users in very powerful ways. It also allows us to react to certain situations fairly quickly. So the example that we just looked at, we are able to come in and relatively quickly address it because we can operate in a very precise way in this rule system. And then ultimately, as I mentioned, explainability is key. We want our users not only to, in the moment, understand why they're seeing certain suggestions, but over time, hopefully they can learn a little bit about why they are seeing these suggestions repeatedly, and hopefully learn something about this aspect of correctness that they might incorporate into their own writing style. And as I said, augmentation really is the key here. It's never the goal for us to replace the user, but really just to give them these superpowers and communicate more effectively. Now, all of that sounds great, but we all know also that large-scale machine learning is critical, and we have the ability to augment these high-precision experiences with large-scale models. As we have tens of millions of users engage with our product every day, we realize that they all have very different needs and face all kinds of different writing challenges every single day. And so with machine learning, we can actually scale to all of these edge cases fairly elegantly over time. And furthermore, what we can also do is go beyond just this notion of operating at, let's say, a word level or a small phrase level, but really take in much more context to the left and to the right as we are producing suggestions. So we can look at sentence level rewrites, as I mentioned before. We can even operate at a paragraph level. And that's the only way of doing this really is to use machine learning at scale. And then something that is really important to me as well is the ability to adapt to different types of contexts. Another separate slide for that later on, where we'll unpack this a little bit. All right, so now I've talked about how this actually looks like in the system, but how do we know it's working? How do we know we've produced a high quality set of technologies and a high quality user experience? Well, let's talk about evaluation a little bit. We came up with a framework that really captures three buckets of signals that we utilize to evaluate the quality of overarching system. The first is expert judgment. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with your traditional precision and recall measures that really operate over expert annotated sentences or data. So we can measure where did we get it right, where did we get it wrong. And that's quite helpful. But it's something that we also have found to be truly a sort of augmentation to that type of signal is to use side-by-side evaluation. So the idea there is to look at the output of our system and compare that with the output of a human. And then we take those pairs and show them to other raters, and then they, not knowing which came from a human or from the machine, have to tell us which one they find better. And this is really our methodology to figuring out whether we can beat a human on the task, whether we can be truly superhuman. But that in of itself is not enough. We also have to reason about how our users actually engage with the product. And that's not only how many suggestions are we sending to them, but also how are they accepting or ignoring them. If we realize that they tend to ignore certain types of suggestions, that's a very strong signal for us to think about the underlying quality. And then the third bucket is what we call user perception. It's really a measure of how our users value these suggestions. And oftentimes as you optimize your models, you increase the quality incrementally, but that might not translate to users realizing that the product actually has improved and has gotten better. So that's something we are measuring. And fundamentally, we want to understand whether Grammarly truly helps our users with their most important communication and writing challenges. So to tie this back to the title of the talk, We know that we will have achieved superhuman communication assistance when our system produces suggestions that are measurably better than what a human would produce, but that can be at the expense of user engaging with the product and them perceiving the product and the value of the product. So that's our vision of creating this superhuman communication assistant. Okay, cool. So we spent some time now in the revision stage here. Let me talk briefly also about these other stages in this journey. So let's jump in first into the comprehension phase here on the left. And we have built already a couple of really powerful capabilities in this space. The first one is our tone detector. This one really tries to help you understand how you might come across and how specifically your tone might come across to the reader. So as you can see here, we might give you these emojis that might tell you whether you're coming across as confident, joyful, or maybe neutral, or perhaps a little reserved. And I think this gives our users a ton of confidence in figuring out how to best hit that tone depending on who you're writing to. Another set of capabilities that we've built try to tackle this point of making sure that you're hitting the most important points in your writing and elevate them, make sure that they do stand out. So we have built a capability that highlights to you as the writer which section in an email might be a little buried and which ones might the reader might engage with more actively. And based on that, you can now decide whether you want to take a section maybe that was previously buried in a paragraph and pull it out in different ways. And beyond this, we've also built capabilities that shorten your text a little bit and make sure that only the key information is present and make sure that that pops. But it's quite clear that this is not the end for us. We are going into so many different other directions that really aim to bridge that gap that exists between creating communication and for others to consume and comprehend that communication. Because really it's the same coin, it's just different sides. So I'm pretty excited about some of the products that we have in the pipeline in this space. Now let's talk about composition a little bit. We already have built awesome utility capabilities that really focus on helping our users remain productive and in sort of a flow state. So the first has to do with autocorrect. So we autocorrect many of the important spelling mistakes that you might make. But we also went beyond this, and we've built a phrasal autocomplete feature, which you can see at the bottom right. And the goal there is to complete your sentences just based on the first few words that you've written. Now, again, we're not stopping there. And what is quite unique and I think is interesting is to think about these phases or these stages of the communication journey and see how we might bridge those and how we might sort of utilize technology to make them just a little bit easier to get through. So for example, you could imagine that, you have this idea, you roughly know what you want to say, and now you start to get your thoughts on paper, but you might all of a sudden realize you had another idea, right? Now you go back into this conception phase. How can technology make these sort of iterations, these micro loops within this larger loop a little bit more effortless? How can we make this a little bit easier and more delightful such that you can focus more on the creative aspect of communication and worry less about sort of the mechanical aspects of typing words and formatting your writing? So those are some of the general areas that we are exploring. And it's clear how technology can help with this in the advent of generative large language models. These are all fundamental tasks that these models could help us with. We just have to figure out how to do this in a very user-centric way. Okay, so I've talked about revision in a good amount of detail and gave you a little bit of a taste for what we're doing across these other stages. One thing I mentioned before that is really important is that communication is a very subjective task. Everybody has a slightly different approach, personal preferences, and everybody behaves different depending on the context that they're in. So it's clear to me that a one-size-fits-all approach is just not going to cut it. And that's where context really comes in. To truly build a communication assistant that helps tens of millions of users every day, these contextual signals actually really matter. That includes who you're writing to. If I'm writing a message to my boss, I probably behave differently than if I'm writing a message to my best friend. Or when I'm on the go on my mobile phone, I probably approach communication differently than if I'm when I'm standing at my desk writing on my desktop. Now, what domain am I writing in? Am I writing an academic paper, or is this a business communication, or is this something else? Actually matters when we think about what types of assistance you might need. And then ultimately, what's I think really critical is to figure out what task you're on. What are you actually trying to accomplish? Are you trying to convince somebody? Are you trying to, land this job, and then you have to sort of get the recruiter to respond to you? Everybody, when they communicate, have a task in mind. And I think we need to be able to reason about this to truly provide superhuman communication assistance. And I, for one, am very excited to see how machine learning and NLP can come together at Grammarly to help our users with those really foundational and fundamental tasks. So I'm at time. I will leave you with a slide that just tells you that we're hiring. I mentioned all these different roles and people that come together to create this very user-centric product. And we are hiring across all of those roles. So please check out our jobs page that I've linked here. But yeah, I think otherwise we should be good to go to cut over to questions.
Awesome. That was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Timo. It was such a fascinating talk. We've all used Grammarly at some point, and it was great to have you shed some light on how it works behind the scenes.
Awesome.
For me, when I saw the sentence completion prompts on the screen when I was back in the day using Grammarly, that's when I kind of realized we are on the right track. Awesome. So we have a few questions from the audience. The first one is from Hari Bharat, and they ask, does Grammarly's ML model keep improving itself or learn with users either accepting or declining the changes suggested by Grammarly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned before, we have a pretty complex sort of development cycle where we really want to understand deeply what users engage with, what they don't engage with. At this point, we focus less on sort of background automation, but really focus more on what are some of these fundamental moments where users might not be getting all the value that they should be getting from the product. And of course, we look at certain types of signals of how they're engaging with it to help us fine tune. But as I said before, that's not the only signal. We also look at their sort of more qualitative interpretation of quality, as well as our expert judgment. So it's all of these signals that come together, and it's really important that we have sort of very strong opinions of why we would want to release an update, let's say, to the model. It needs to be grounded in a strong articulation of quality across those dimensions.
That makes a lot of sense. And I believe that also ties to your human-in-the-loop process, where if the humans say that what model is producing is correct, only then you push an update. Yeah,
precisely. Okay. Yep.
Perfect. Next question is from Paul, and they ask, do you have any advice on how to start a human-in-the-middle exploration?
Oof. Yeah, that's an open-ended question. Yeah, I think the way to go about this really is to start with the user problem, right? Like, what fundamental problem are you trying to solve for the end user? And then from there, oftentimes you can start pretty small in a very opinionated way. You might build some very simple solution that focuses on high precision, just to validate that you can actually use technology to solve this problem. Now, from there, you observe your user, you see what they do or what they don't do with the product. And from there, you can start to scale it out. And I think, as we showed before, we utilize still a rule-based system alongside a large machine learning system. And I think that's the way to go as you are exploring new capabilities. You start with a very easy to understand and very opinionated product experience based on rules or heuristics or very simple technologies. And then once you feel like you are solving these problems, now we can scale it out. Now we can utilize larger models. Now, that doesn't apply to every single problem out there. Sometimes you might have to start with machine learning from day one, right? But more often than not, I think it's helpful to really understand whether you're solving a real user problem first.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for answering that. Roshni asks, how do these models work across different languages? Or how does the correctness model adapt as the language changes?
Yeah, we are focused on providing English communication assistance, and so far we haven't had the need to expand beyond languages. Now you can select the type of dialect of English that you're communicating in, and there we adapt the system to some extent. But yeah, I think at this point our models have focused on English communication. And if you unpack English communication, that's such a broad space, be this in the workplace, business communication, from personal communication on your mobile phone. So that is enough opportunity space for us at this point. But yeah, it's also quite clear that these types of models are quite powerful in how they scale and how they can be adapted. I think for me at this point is a little bit more about adapting to the different types of user needs and different contexts that they might be in rather than languages.
Got it. Thanks so much. And that kind of leads me to a question of my own. How does the model generalize over, say, different domains? So if I'm talking about, say if I work in a healthcare space and I am using my Slack to talk to my coworkers about some healthcare stuff, how does the model generalize across domains?
Yeah, that's a great question. And correctness is actually a little bit easier to reason about, because a spelling mistake is probably a spelling mistake no matter what context you're in, unless we're now realizing, oh, you're actually talking about a specific entity, right? That's not a spelling mistake of another word, but it's actually a proper name of a product, or in medical space of a drug. And I think there we have to start to adapt to it. And there we try still to be fairly surgical, right? Be less the user can supply their own dictionary or these types of approaches. Now, some of the other capabilities that that I described around clarity and engagement and delivery, I think there gets a little bit more interesting in what's a little bit more subjective in sort of what type of assistant is relevant depending on where you are. And I'd say we're in the early days there to really figure out how to do this well at large scale. But I think these vectors of information, be this where you do your writing, the audience that you're communicating with, the task that you're on, will all flow into a scalable system to this, right? Because it's quite clear we won't really get to a large scale if we have to pre sort of assign behaviors in the product depending on where you do your writing.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for answering all those questions, Timo. We really enjoyed your talk, and thank you so much for that great presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.